Thanks, Raphael. Thanks, Colleen. So I'm, in a sense, following on a bit from Colleen's presentation. This is a project that I'm doing with Coral, who's here, and Seamus and Chris, who are also here. Jerry's not here today. So this is a project that Colleen referred to, that was defining out of field. Press the right button. We're looking at developing a clear definition that will inform policy, practice and research. Basically, as Colleen has indicated, there's sort of this sort of a blurriness around what out of field means. And so the Victorian Department of Education actually want to have a clear definition, because I think they want to inform their initiatives. At a broad level, out of field teaching was developed as a construct to highlight this mismatch between teachers' disciplinary background and the subject they're teaching, or the year level they're teaching, or maybe even the specialist role that they teach, depending on which research you're talking about. So in Victoria, as Colleen's indicated, the teacher registration process doesn't identify the specialisation or level of schooling. And as a result of that, that actually means we don't have that specialisation data that we can go to see the extent of out of field teachers within the state. And so this lack of common understanding makes it difficult to assess the extent and also the impact. And this has actually been even recognised in some of the Irish research that recognises that there is no definition within Australia, which is quite interesting. And that it's up to the discretion of the states, territories and individual principals according to their teacher qualifications. So research shows that out of field teaching is complex. And as a result, this binary label of qualified, unqualified, unspecialised, etc., and in-field, out-of-field are sometimes not useful because it actually hides the complexity of the concept, and failing to include the degrees of fit or misfit between appointment, qualifications, and experience. So Sharplin talked about that. And Rafaela has talked about 3 different ways of thinking about out of field: a technical formal condition relating to I'm not qualified, a condition of lacking expertise, I feel I don't have the necessary knowledge of the content or teaching approaches, also a condition of identity and feeling out of field, so feeling like an outsider. I think it's useful that research is informed by a definition that's transparent and actually identifies what is meant by out of field, and it's clearly defined, but it's also set within the context, within the education systems, policies and practices in which that's being used. So the research question that we've got is, what aspects need to be included in a definition of out of field suitable for the particular Victorian government school context? So in terms of the process, it is basically desktop research. It's a literature search. And so we had a number of objectives. We're also going to be looking at mapping the extent of out of field, but we're just focusing in this presentation on the definition. So collating definitions of out of field to some criteria. We used different search parameters, looking at learning areas, levels of education, different methodologies of data collection, and different scope of analysis. And we use different sorts of sources, both academic, government sources, online sources, different databases, etc. The process of extracting definitions involves looking at the criteria for working out the different dimensions, and then teasing out the implications that they might have for research, policy and practice. And that's where we're getting to today in this presentation. After this, we'll be putting that together into a white paper, which is distributed to get some feedback from experts in the field. So these are the criteria that we've developed. The first 3 are what I'm going to focus on today. because they sort of talk about the context. So a qualification context, so what is a teacher qualified to teach? Capability context relating to that idea of what they're capable of, and then looking at identity, how a teacher identifies as. So each of those have got different dimensions, and for each of those there is a standard that we've set, and we've put them into different bands. So I'd just like to go through each of those. So in terms of qualification, each of them have some assumptions. So when you're talking about qualification and what a teacher's qualified as, there's an assumption that there's policy that determines what makes a teacher qualified, and that's our Victorian Institute for Teaching Regulations, and I'll show some of that in a minute. There's an understanding that they would have basic subject knowledge that's necessary to a necessary prerequisite to teach, and that's gained through those qualifications. It's assumed that the discipline qualification, however, does not guarantee that they're going to be a quality teacher. And when it comes to out-of-field teachers in Australia, we can still say that they're all sufficiently trained teachers, trained educators. And out-of-field refers to this misfit between what teachers are teaching and what their qualifications are. And there's 3 dimensions to this qualification. So zipping over to look at the bottom part shows the standards that we've set, the different dimensions, and then the 3 bands. So looking first at technical alignment, and this refers to the policy setting. And so while the teachers are registered as a teacher, there is assumption that they've actually got some qualifications behind them. And these qualifications set, these are the entry guidelines to get into an education degree. So they would have to have a minimum of a minor, which means at least no more than 2 subjects at first year level in the particular discipline that they're going to take in and have as their method as part of their education degree. So it dictates the minimum level of discipline study. And most countries would have something like this, I assume, to get into some education degree at that secondary level. Primary is different because that's a generalist, and you're not expected to have any study prior. Now, in terms of looking at how that's interpreted or how that's represented in research, even Australian-based research doesn't necessarily comply with these entry requirements. So even the Weldon study, they said you're out of field if you, or that you're in field if you had only studied 1 subject at that second tertiary level, whereas the requirement actually has 2 subjects. The TIMS study precludes any minor qualifications and only focuses on majors. So that means that the proportion of out-of-field teachers is going to be greater when you look at TIMS, use the TIMS data. But McConney and Price's research was spot on. So there's 3 bands for that technical alignment. There's full alignment, where you would expect the discipline and the methodology study that they've done as part of their education degree that aligns with what they're teaching. Band 2 refers to partial alignment, where it's maybe only discipline or method. And then band 3 is where there's misalignment. So there's what they're teaching is not related to their background. The next is a specialism alignment, where this idea that we've got a number of subjects in our curriculum that are actually composite degrees or composite subjects. So they've got multiple disciplines. And a number of researchers talk about, Ingersoll talks about a broad subject like science and then narrow subject like chemistry. And as a result of that, you have some subjects that are, some teaching that is fully aligned, because if I'm a chemistry teacher and I'm teaching general science, then that's considered fully aligned. But for some, it may be only near alignment. So maybe you're teaching an actual chemistry subject, and that's sort of related to biology, but if you're teaching maths or English, and that's a far alignment. So that's the 3 bands there. In terms of phase, so phase could refer to Sharplin's idea of phase, which is primary, secondary, or tertiary. So, and this is determined by your actual education qualification. So field might be, so it might also be year level. So you might be fully aligned in that you are teaching at the specified level. If you've got an education degree that focuses only on the secondary years, and you're teaching in secondary, then you're fully aligned. But if you're teaching in if you're qualified as a primary teacher but teaching in secondary, then there's a misalignment there. So the idea of this focus on qualification, it broadens it from just being in field and out of field, and recognises that you can be in or out of field, but in relation to that broad subject, in relation to the specialism that you're teaching, but also thinking about the year levels and the type of school that you're teaching in. The second criterion relates to capability. And so what is a teacher capable of teaching? And the assumptions there relate to basically a teacher is suitable for teaching based on their experience and inherent capabilities. It recognises that teaching's a learning process, and then that early career teachers have a steep learning curve, and that experienced teachers, early career teachers can be exacerbated by out of field teaching and can actually find it quite difficult. But experienced teachers can also experience a re-novicing. So in terms of the bands associated with that, you have this notion of expertise that can be developed on the job. And so a teacher could be considered as capable if they've had a lot of experience, practiced if they've had some experience. So that idea of teaching the same subject multiple times can actually be quite important for gathering that expertise, but also be beginning. And also career stage, recognising that experienced teachers can often cope with out of field teaching better than a graduate teacher, but that even experienced teachers can struggle. So there's 3 different gradings there. And the work by Weldon, for example, there he differentiates between teachers of 5 years, up to 5 years, and teachers of more than 5 years. And you can actually see that the majority of out of field teaching is actually been done by those early career teachers. Identity refers to how a teacher sees themselves, and it relates to their commitment, the way they see themselves in relation to the subject, the socio-historical interaction of the subject, and how that equips them with the competence and confidence. So in terms of identity, there's the three dimensions. The first is commitment, and that comes down to that idea of what you're committed to. A personal commitment is someone who might be pursuing that interest, and they're actually personally interested in the subject that they're teaching out of field. The professional commitment refers to, that they've got that commitment to actually, make the best of it and really committed to their students. And then those that are just being compliant and going through the motions and doing it because they have to. Then you've got that idea of how you see yourself in relation to that subject. From proximal, where you see yourself positively in relation to it. Peripheral, it's a little bit further away. Distal, meaning very far. And then different degrees of confidence, high, medium, and low. So you can see that we've been using different literature to develop these criteria. So that's the full set of criteria that we looked at in those 3 areas. And that becomes a useful, I think, way of thinking about the various dimensions of what it means to teach a subject out of field. In addition to those 3, and that I won't go into here, but probably the most important part of these 2 is this notion of the proportion of a teacher's load, whether it's a whole or whether it's a part of their load. And also this idea of the pathway. So that idea of where teachers can upgrade their professions, and that a career trajectory leads to whether they do professional development and it leads to formal recognition, or whether it's a temporary type of appointment, or whether they stay teaching. So there's a number of other things that need to come into play when thinking about how you define an out-of-field teacher. So the next steps for us is to compile some research-based scenarios, classifying them using the different dimensions, consider more some of those structures and pathways, and consider those implications for research, policy and practice. And as an example, we've got a scenario there of Daniel, who'd been teaching for 30 years and been teaching maths. He's a qualified science teacher, been teaching maths his whole life. He did some additional study to become a specialist in ICT, but he's never actually felt like he's a real maths teacher because he's untrained. So for him, that actual training has been really important. So in terms of the different dimensions and words, we've got technical, and there's technical and specialism misalignment in relation to maths teaching, but he's phase aligned in that he was qualified as a science teacher, a secondary teacher. He's practiced as a teacher of maths, and he's an experienced teacher. He's compliant because that's all he wants to be. He doesn't want to do additional study, or he doesn't want to, it's not important for him to improve in being a maths teacher. He's got a distal identity, and he's got a medium level of confidence, and it's part of a broader load. So there's non-acceptance of the role. He teaches every year, but there's no commitment to professional learning. And so he will continue to contribute to the out-of-field statistics despite his years of experience. And that is it.